Today the moon is full and it's going to rise at 8 p.m. So I have this app on my phone called Photographer's Ephemeris that will show me exactly where the moon will rise. So at 8 p.m. the moon will rise right over that bridge. So I have a 400 millimeter lens with a 1.4 time teleconverter on a crop frame sensor, which increases it by 1.5 times. So something like 600 millimeters to get the moon rising. So I can practice my manual settings because it's very difficult. Unfortunately, as you can see, it's quite cloudy, so we'll see how it goes. Oh. Hello everyone, Tsula here of Tsula's Big Adventures. This is chapter 16 of my complete video guide to becoming an amateur astronomer. Chapter 16, entry-level astrophotography. And when I say entry-level, I mean entry-level. If you would like to know how to use PixInsight or how to remove stars from your astrophotos, this is not the video for you. But if you're just starting out and you want to share photos of things you've been looking at in the sky with your telescope, with your family and friends, you're in the right place. I hope you've been enjoying your journey to becoming an amateur astronomer. If you're like most people, it probably started out something like this. You walked outside and you looked at the stars and you thought, what are those stars and which ones are planets? So you got a planisphere like this and you started trying to figure it out, and then it went on from there. You got some binoculars, and you turned your binoculars to Orion, and you thought, holy cow, look at all that stuff in his sword. What is that? I need a telescope. Then you got a telescope, and next thing you knew, you had a whole garage full of them. Or you got asked to go on a camping trip with a friend and you saw the Milky Way for the first time and you thought, wow, and you were hooked for life. Or your science teacher told you that you're made of stardust and then you were hooked on astronomy after that. Or maybe you went to a public observatory and you saw Saturn for the first time and you nearly fainted or you wept. Or you're like me and you watched your country launch a rocket and put a man on the moon, and you were hooked on astronomy for the rest of your life. But whatever way you got into the hobby, at some point you were looking through your telescope at some neat things and you thought, wow, I really would like to share these with my family and friends. So you went out and you bought one of these gizmos and you put it on your telescope and you attached your smartphone to it and you got some modest pictures, but they weren't very good. And you thought, wow, there must be a better way than that. And maybe you used a point and shoot camera, and you can do that by putting it into where your eyepiece goes. I skipped over I do have this gizmo. We used it once and we skipped right over the smartphone method, and I don't own a point and shoot, so we skipped over that method too. So I won't be explaining that, but if you would like to take some pictures with a DSLR or mirrorless camera, then we can talk about that and how to do it. What I think and what I recommend is that if you would like to get into astrophotography, you should start out with something very modest and get acquainted with your camera, get a tripod and your camera that you probably already own, and go out during the day and take some pictures of moon or at twilight, some moonscapes, or advance from there to some twilight scenes, and then from there some Milky Way shots, and as you advance, some time lapses and moon rises and Milky Way time lapses, and then from there to deep sky astrophotography. That would be my recommendation, because that way you get acquainted with your camera and the settings, as opposed to going out in the dark and trying to figure things out. Now let's talk about equipment. You need a tripod, a camera, and a lens. Your tripod can be any brand. I personally like Manfrotto. It can be aluminum or carbon. It just has to be sturdy. I like Manfrotto because the plates are interchangeable between all my tripods. But whatever tripod you get, just make sure it's sturdy and not some Kmart brand. And you need a sturdy ball head that will allow you to tilt all the way up. For your camera, you need either a DSLR or mirrorless camera. It just needs to be able to take interchangeable lenses. And it can be a camera you already have, but if you're in the market for a camera, the main brands are Canon, Nikon, and Sony. Those are the main ones used by astrophotographers, and I'd say about 90% of astrophotographers use Canon. I prefer Sony. That's what I've always used, and I know their settings, and they make excellent cameras. So that's what I use, but you can use whatever brand you have or one of the major three, as long as it can be used in manual mode and take different lenses and shoot in RAW. Today's modern cameras are very sophisticated, and pretty much any brand you get, they're going to meet those criteria and it will work fine. But if you're in the market for a camera, after you decide which brand you want, then you have to decide whether you want a full frame sensor or a crop sensor. All digital cameras have sensors, and they have pixels that collect the photons in black and white, and on top of those pixels is a layer of red, green, and blue filters that are called the colored filter array, and that was invented by a man named Bayer who worked for Kodak, and the filters mix the pixels into a colored photo in a process called debayering, and that's about as technical as I'm going to get. Your camera will have various numbers of pixels on the sensor, and the more pixels, the better the resolution the camera will have. It might have anywhere from 12 to 60 megapixels, and each pixel will have a size of pixel in microns from 1 or 2 all the way up to 8. Phones have very sophisticated night modes now that allow you to shoot astrophotograhy pictures, but the size of the pixels are only 1 or 2 microns, and therefore they're going to be very noisy or grainy, and you're never going to get as good a picture with your phone as you will with a DSLR or mirrorless camera. And for that reason, I'm not going to be talking about using your phone to take astrophotos. In addition, you can get much better deep sky pictures with a dedicated astrophotography camera than you can with a DSLR or mirrorless camera. However, I don't own one, and I don't intend to get one in the foreseeable future, and therefore I'm not going to be talking about dedicated astrophotography cameras. The saying goes for writers, write about what you know, and the same applies to videographers. Make videos about what you know. I don't know anything about dedicated astrophotography cameras, and I'm not going to be talking about using a phone camera either. If you want to find out more about using a dedicated astrophotography camera, there are plenty of channels out there that will tell you all about it. You can also get this book, and it will tell you all about it. If you're interested in finding out all about how digital cameras work and very technical information about cameras, then I would recommend this book, The Deep Sky Imaging Primer, 3rd edition by Charles Bracken. It's very detailed. I tried to read it. It tells you all about how a digital camera collects photons, and then it has an analog to digital converter and a well that can only hold so much. And I tried to read it, but it just didn't interest me. But if you can get past that part, he goes into explicit detail about auto guiding and how to get rid of noise and how to process your images and PixInsight, and I did not get that far. But if you want to get really into the hobby, this is a good book. But back to crop cameras versus full frame cameras. sensors. The sensors can be cropped. Like this camera right here has a cropped sensor. The cropped sensor will frame in your subject closer, but a crop sensor will not have as good a resolution as a full frame camera. On the other hand, a camera with fewer pixels might have bigger size pixels, like 12 to 16 megapixels, but each pixel might be 6 microns. As an astrophotographer, you're always trying to get rid of noise. Noise is the bane of astrophotography, so your main concern is going to be reducing noise more so than better resolution. You can get a full frame camera that will have better resolution, but you don't want one that has a lot of megapixels, like 45 to 60, because those will have good resolution, but they're going to have each pixel being a smaller size micron, and therefore they're going to have more noise. You want a camera that has pixels that are in the range of 6 microns. The Canon 6D, for example, has 6.4 size microns. My Sony a7S III has only 12 megapixels, but each one is 8.4 microns, making it an excellent camera for low light settings and low light sensitivity. But I don't use it for astrophotography because it's big. This is a Sony a6600. It's a cropped sensor. It has 24 megapixels, but each one is about 4 microns. The Canon 60D is a cropped sensor. It has 18 megapixels and each one is 4.3 microns. And I've had experience with both of those cameras, and they're excellent cameras. The main thing you need to have is a camera that can shoot in RAW, has a flip out screen, can take interchangeable lenses, and can be set to manual mode. Then you're going to need to get a good lens. You can use the kit lens that your camera came with if that's all you have, but you're probably not going to have the capability you might need for nighttime shooting with it. Zoom lenses are great, they have a range, but they also may not go to as big an aperture as what you call a prime lens. A prime lens is like this one. It's 14 millimeters set focal length, and it's excellent for shooting Milky Way pictures. And it goes down to f1.4, which is a big aperture. For a longer focal length, like 200 millimeters, that might be good for or a deeper object. And you might get a range that goes up to 200, a 70 to 200, but it may only go down to f4 or f5.6. But if a kit lens is all you have, or a zoom lens, then use it. When you have more money, then you can go out and get a better lens with a bigger aperture, or f-stop. Or better yet, later you can attach your camera to your telescope, and your telescope will become your lens. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, let's talk about the exposure triangle. You need to know your camera's manual settings. You cannot set your camera to auto for astrophotography, and you cannot use your autofocus for astrophotography either. So it's time to learn your camera's settings and the exposure triangle, which is aperture or f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. The f-stop is how big the aperture is of your camera, just like a telescope, and it's only that in a camera it's described as f-stop. For example, a big aperture on a camera would be f1.4, and the reason the number is smaller is because it's actually a fraction. It's 1 over 1.4. For astrophotography, f-stops are 1.4 or 2 or better. Now your shutter speed is going to depend on your subject. Your shutter speed is how long that aperture is open. And the longer that aperture is open, the more light it lets in, but the more chance for star trails. Your shutter speed will depend on what you're photographing. For the Milky Way, you might want maybe 15 to 20 second shutter speed. For deep sky, you might want anywhere from 30 seconds all the way up to 5 minutes or 8 minutes or more, depending on your equipment. And star trail pictures, you might want 25 seconds because you want star trails for a star trail picture. But your The time you can leave your shutter speed open before you get star trails will be determined by the 500 rule, which says take 500 and divide it by the focal length of your lens. So for example, if you're using a 50mm lens, 500 divided by 50 is 10, or 10 seconds. After that, you'll have star trails. Some people think the 500 rule is not reliable, but I think it's a good rule of thumb. ISO is the amount of introduced light. It's light introduced internally by your camera. Sounds great, it can make your picture a lot brighter, but you always want to keep your ISO as low as possible without underexposing your photo, because artificial light creates noise. But sometimes it's inevitable and you have to use an ISO to get the correct exposure. So how do you know when your picture is properly exposed? Well, I'm going to explain how. I've chosen this scenic location for my skyscape. I'm going to get the full moon rising over that mountain and reflected on this water. So I'm going to set my camera on my tripod, turn the dial to M, which stands for manual mode, and that will give me complete control over the f-stop or aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. I might start with some suggested settings and see if that works. So I'm going to set the f-stop, and every camera is different and you can set the dials to what makes most sense to you. But on mine, the f-stop is set with this dial. Some manual lenses make you turn the dial on the lens to set the f-stop, but this one I use the camera. And I don't want a wide open f1.8 aperture for this shot because the moon is very bright and that may cause the moon to be overexposed. And secondarily, when you have a wide open aperture like f1.8, whatever is in front of the camera is in focus while what's behind it will be blurry. It's called a shallow depth of field. That's highly coveted by photographers and videographers, but not what you want in a landscape shot or your skyscape. You want more of the picture to be in focus. And also, a wide open aperture may blow out the moon, so I'm going to choose something like f5.6 or f8. For my shutter speed, I might try something like a 1/6 of a second. And for my ISO, maybe 200 or 400, not too high because the moon is so bright. Then we're going to see if those settings give us the proper exposure. And the way we're going to do that is, on your LCD screen, there will be some lines on a Canon at the bottom in the center, and if the indicator is way off to the left of those lines, that is an underexposed picture. If the indicator is way off to the right of those lines, that's an overexposed picture, and if the indicator is right in the middle, that is a well-exposed picture. On Sony, in the center at the bottom, it says MM, and it's numbers, and if the numbers are negative, your picture is underexposed. And if they're positive, it's overexposed, and if it says 0, you're well exposed. But there's another way to determine if your picture is well exposed, and that's called the histogram. The histogram is just an approximate representation of the distribution of data. In this case, the data is the exposure. The histogram is that little icon that looks like a picture of mountains. That's your histogram, and if your mountains or lumps are way off to the left, your picture is underexposed. If the lumps or mountains are way off to the right, you're overexposed. But if you have a nice little mound in the middle, that is a well-exposed picture. So you want your histogram showing so you can determine if your picture is well exposed. You always want to keep those mounds as far to the right as possible without overexposing your picture. You can determine what data is displayed on your LCD screen, or what Canon calls live view, by hitting your display button. When you're framing your picture up, hit your display button so that you unclutter the screen and you can see as much of it as possible, so that you can frame up your picture and get your object using the rule of thirds on one of those lines and not dead in the center. Make the picture nice and pretty and pleasing to the eye, and once you have it framed, then hit your display button again to bring your data back. If you hit it repeatedly, it will eventually show the histogram, because you need to know what your settings are and you need to see your histogram to make sure that your picture is well exposed. And that's how you determine if you have a well exposed picture. So my methodology for getting into the field of astrophotography is how I explained it way back in chapter 1. Learn about astronomy, learn about the night sky, learn about using your naked eye and then binoculars and then a telescope to learn your way around the universe, to become a proper amateur astronomer, and then and only then try to jump into astrophotography. But even now that we are ready to embark on our journey to delving into astrophotography, you still need to take it easy and slow. Start off with something easy in order to learn your camera's manual settings. Start with something like a skyline with twilight, or a moon, or a moonlit snowy peak, or maybe a moonrise, and then progress from there to something harder, a comet, Milky Way, panoramas, then maybe a Milky Way arch, or then maybe an iconic Milky Way with a beautiful foreground, and then move up to time lapses, and then deep sky astrophotography. And the reason why is that you need to learn how to use your camera's manual settings at night when it's dark, and also you need to learn how to focus at night, which is not easy. There are some ways that will help you, Botanoff mask for example, but you must learn your manual controls and manually focus. You must shoot in RAW. You cannot use JPEG. You need to have your focus magnifier somewhere handy to make the picture bigger on the LCD screen to help you get in sharp focus. You need to manually focus. You need to be able to set your camera to bulb so you can take pictures longer than 30 seconds. So because most cameras limit your shutter speed to 30 seconds unless you have an external intervalometer which allows you to manually set it to longer exposures. Now let's talk about settings. Go into your menu and set your camera to RAW. You don't want JPEGs because they're compressed and you lose a lot of data, and RAW files will allow you to have all the data and have more control when processing your photos later in Photoshop or other apps. A lot of people will disagree with me on this next part, but I use long exposure noise reduction, or LENR. And I will recommend that you turn that on. I'll explain why later. Set your camera to mechanical shutter, not electronic. And if it says you need to set it to shutter release without a lens, set that. Turn your LCD screen as low as possible and flip it out to make it comfortable to look through. Set your white balance to daytime or auto or 5200 Kelvin. Turn down the display brightness so you don't bother your neighbors. Now we're going to practice with some of the things I mentioned: Milky Way shots, or moonlit scenes, or twilight skylines, or a conjunction if one's available, something like that, so that we get comfortable with our camera's manual settings. Now here are some suggestions for settings. For Milky Way single shot, you might want 15 to 20 second shutter speed at ISO 6400 or f2. For your foreground, you can shoot a long exposure. It's not moving like we are hurtling through space, so it can be f5.6 or a 4-minute exposure, and the ISO for whatever makes it the proper exposure. For your moonrise, you might want 1/6 of a second, ISO 400, and maybe f4. For a moonlit nightscape, maybe something like 10 seconds at f2.8, ISO 800. It really depends on the conditions. Just go out and experiment and practice using your camera's manual settings until you get comfortable. And once you're comfortable, then we're going to talk about deep sky astrophotography. When we get to deep sky, we're going to put it on either a star tracker or an equatorial mount that can track the night sky. In part 2, we're going to take all the pictures that we captured when we were practicing and learning our camera's manual settings and talk about how to process them. I'm going to be talking about using Photoshop because that's what I use and that's what I know. And yes, it's $9.99 a month, but it's well worth it, and that's what I'm going to be talking about: processing the photos we've been practicing with in Photoshop, and then we'll move on to deep sky astrophotography entry level. Well, that's it for Chapter 16, Part 1, Entry-Level Astrophotography. I hope you got something out of it. Go out and practice, learn your camera's manual settings, and I'll see you in Part 2 when we talk about deep sky astrophotography entry level.